is. And the holidays are just so wonderful of that. I mean, it's like a full-on mindfulness retreat. Just, you know, preparing the dinner and the whole thing that leads up to that, let alone the experience of the dinner and then afterwards. And oh, wow. I mean, so the kind of, you know, the external, internal, external that we talked about last week, which, for those who weren't here, is essentially where, you know, this is so great too, especially when it is with family, who you can actually look the person in the eye, and whatever it is, you know, that they're talking about. I have a very vivid image in my mind right now of my cousin talking about sort of like how so much of I think it was, oh yeah, it was about Edison and Westinghouse, and how, like, yeah, I mean, everything that popular history understands about Edison and the creation of electricity is completely wrong. And I'm sitting there and listening to him go and so forth, and this is amazing. I mean, you know, he's espousing an entire, you know, refutation of what is known as the common understanding of the creation of electricity and so this isn't like, you know, some little light topic like, you know, I like, you know, fat-free cream cheese versus the regular cream cheese or something like this. It's dealing with a big aspect of our lives. And so as I'm watching him, and he's impassioned about this because he just read this book, he had just finished this book, and so I started in the space of where I'm like, okay, I'm feeling right now indifference about this, but he is not feeling indifferent about this, and trying to meet him where he's at in his space, and then having that moment of like, okay, so I recognize what's going on internally with me, and then I'm looking at him. So now I start watching to see if, like, what's going on internally with me, I start to see that somehow shift with him as he's appearing to me. And it took a while, but it's eventually, there was some point where, you know, you could just see, and of course these could be just obviously the typical visual clues of where, you know, I hope that I wasn't seeming or appearing disinterested, you know, because I really was kind of trying to stick with his whole theory. And but at a certain point he was like, yeah, so anyway, I don't know, history changes. And I was like, yes, that's it. But for that 20 minutes was amazing. I mean, because then obviously the experience ended up being so much more about how this is really working, you know, how it's really working. It's not so much about the actual conversation as what's underneath the conversation, what's really going on between these two human beings. And, you know, that just parlayed and through countless football games and over the past few days. Really, really, really amazing to, and I have to say, it makes me tremendously grateful for what's been taught here at this center, and because what can really be, at the end of the day, I think it comes down to what we talked about in terms of what is the truth of your experience. And in the context of this, it really is what in any given situation or experience gives you a little bit of space, you know? Maybe that space can be gargantuan, you know, where it's like, all right, I am totally free of being afflicted about this in any way. Or it's just that amount of space that gets you out of this seeming to be unpleasant, and you're being upset about it being an unpleasant experience, or because it's very neutral, you know, and you're just like, isn't there something more interesting to talk about or to do or something like that? Or even to that extreme, or I shouldn't say extreme, but the instance where you're like, I prefer to do this, you know, I really don't want to listen to you anymore, you know, I'm going to go do this. You know, that in those moments when that starts to come up, that there's something there that actually you can work with, then it becomes meaningful, you know, and it's no longer so much, I mean, it's so perfect because the shamatha aspect of it is like your single point of focus on the object was how unpleasant this is, you know, or how I really don't care about this that much, or I'd rather be doing this. That's like your object that you're continually working with. But then the vipassana aspect comes into like, well, why is that? You know, really, is the mac and cheese going to be better than the mashed potatoes? And then, and he finished all the mashed potatoes, and I didn't get even have any. They were probably awesome, and around and round and round it goes. So instead of having that experience that we're all so familiar with, then there's something that ultimately frees us a bit up from the suffering a little bit more. Maybe even creates a sense of peace, maybe even some joy. I mean, it really, I certainly there was a time in my life where there's no doubt, I mean, when it came to football, that was like a central aspect of my life from September to February. But it hasn't been that for many years, but with this part of my family, it still is a central aspect of life. And so when it was like, I don't know, the 5th game in the day or whatever it was, and I still, and you look around and then you start to get this, you start looking at what your perception is of other people's level of contentment. And especially when it seems like appears like someone really isn't that content anymore with what was seeming to give them so much contentment 2 hours ago or 3 hours ago. And we can see that shift happen in seconds, whereas, as the saying goes, you're speaking with one of your best friends and she says something and literally like the whole friendship can go in a minute, 1 minute, 20-year friendship because of about 10 words said with enough feeling, that it just punches right through your heart and you're like, that's it. And so it can shift like that, but it's another thing when it's more subtle, it's more subtle and it takes place over time, over, days, months, maybe even years. So yeah, this was thanks for coming last week and giving me a reason to think about this stuff over Thanksgiving holiday with the family, which, was completely awesome. Very awesome. Anybody else like play with this at all? Whether the external, internal, external, or anything of what we talked about last week. Was there anything that was lingering or came up as a question, or just something you noticed? Good. That's good. Let it bake. Let it bake longer. So, talking about just referencing this about feelings and so forth. So tonight we're going to get into the big one, feelings. Yes, exactly. Woo. But before we do that, let's do a little bit of review. It's always good to do that as we move through these 4 domains. So we had kicked things off by this whole approach, shamatha-vipashyana. Shamatha in the sense of what is a peaceful, abiding mind, and vipassana, which is the insight that you use with that peaceful mind, that clear, stable attention that you can get from the shamatha meditation. And once you have that level of stability and clarity, that then you can actually use that to zero in on something that's really going to be worthwhile. Unfortunately, the person who did that 2,500 years ago, with a very open heart and mind, who we historically call the Buddha, he did just that. He was the first one who came along and really combined the two, you know, who had gone to the deep state of what's known as samadhi in the shamatha progression, and then took that level of experience and state of mind and actually focused in on the big questions. You know, it wasn't just about where am I going to get my next bowl of rice. I mean, it was very much about how, you know, why do we suffer like we do, and why does it happen when it happens? What are the causes of that, and can those causes be stopped? And fortunately, he was so passionate and relentless as to that he didn't stop investigating these big questions until he got to a point where things made sense, like life made sense. And I think that's something that's so important here, is that this fundamentally gets to what makes sense for you. That's all that's going to matter. I can tell you what makes sense for me, and other people can share their experience and so forth, but really what it's going to come down to is what it means for you. And in this particular case, he did that. He got to his own truth of the experience as to how things are really working. And obviously, what he was sharing really resonated with people as to reasons, you know, or considerations even. So fortunately, this aspect of the truth of your experience, it really is, it's a phrase that, you know, we could spend 4 weeks on that alone as to what that really means and what that really is. But as we were saying earlier, the framework we'll give it in working with these meditations is that it is what frees you up from that suffering state and gives you a greater sense of serenity in any given moment. And the only way you know, or you prove that to yourself, is if it works. You know, when I was standing there with my cousin as he was debunking the entire history books over the past 60 years, you know, like what was really doing it for me was sitting there and being like, all right, yeah, this really works. This is really working me right now, from keeping me in a really afflicted state of being, because I was absolutely in that very strongly at a certain point. And this is something about it that, you know, the more you understand the truth of your experience, then the more you start to understand the behavior that supports how you think things are working. You know, and when you get to that, and more importantly, is that when you start to really analyze the truth of your experience and you're looking at the behavior, then you can really zero in on that particular behavior that leads to suffering. You know, I mean, you can take it on the other side of the coin and say, well, this is what I really experience great joy in. But for most of us, it's going to be, you know, and we'll get to this later today in terms of talking about pain. There seems to be no other motivator like it. And why is that? You know, why is that? Why isn't what we define as ecstasy, bliss, joy, why doesn't that motivate us like pain does? So we'll explore that. But this is one of the underlying parts of it. And so as we continue to go through this with using the truth of your experience as being your barometer, then we really only can give that any kind of validity because of what really is the inward out approach of the shamatha-vipashyana. Because the science, and this is the thing about it, is you know, science obviously it's incredible what we've done with it. I mean, not only does it create all this tremendously helpful technology and really gives us very useful understandings of the natural world, you know? It's, you know, there are certain things that, especially when it comes to, you know, biomolecular science in terms of sicknesses and diseases, that we can't perceive on a molecular level without the tremendous amount that's been done with science to understand, like, what can kill you, you know, all this that went around with Ebola and so forth. So science is tremendous, but what that approach does is that that's working from the outside in. And there's a very important factor that science leaves out in that regard, and that's you. And that's, at the end of the day, where science will drop off, is that when you start to really focus on you and what constitutes you and why you work the way you do, science can afford a certain amount of answers, both, you know, physiologically, psychologically, and so forth. And thank goodness for psychology, but we know how long that's been around. That's only been a few decades. And that's a continually changing thing. But that's what's so great with the shamatha-vipashyana, is that it starts from there. It's in some ways, its core is all about you in relation to the world. And that's certainly something that will continue to become increasingly more important, you know, when you're practicing this kind of mindfulness in day-to-day living, you know, because there is, you know, we very much are so easily able to trust them. You know, I can easily trust the fact of being able to grab what I perceive as a glass, and that this should not shatter right now for many, many reasons, or many scientific reasons that I believe in right now, why this should not shatter. But we know that that could happen if certain conditions and factors were brought into play. And what's great is that when you're using this understanding of Vipassana and trying to understand, well, okay, well, what would even be a cause as to why this glass continues to remain intact and whole, it goes far deeper than, well, because of the molecular mass that's there and so forth, and the temperature that's engaged with it. It goes far more deeper than that as to why you continue to perceive any type of object or appearance the way you do. And that's the thing that, as easy it is to pick this up and that this glass is still intact, it's another thing as to, for instance, you know, when there is that best friend, and this best friend relationship that you've had for 20 years suddenly evaporates in a matter of seconds. You know, it doesn't seem as though much of science is going to help you right there in understanding why the hell did that happen? How could that happen so easily? And this whole approach can actually get in there. And that's where, so that's the whole thing about, now bringing the two together, obviously science, shamatha-vipashyana, you can have a much more rich, deeper, meaningful life working with the two. So it's not one to be mutually exclusive, but it's actually integrating the two. I mean, it's the same thing the Buddha did with that, was really taking what is happening in, you know, in the reality that we perceive day in and day out, and in trying to add this much more deeper perspective on it, which for many of us does take some study, which I could say from personal experience, as you continue this, it doesn't get boring. I mean, I'll never forget this time where I was down in, I think I was down in Venice or something, in some little shop that had a lot of Buddhist iconography and so forth, and I was looking in the counters, and I think I was looking at malas, you know, which look like rosary beads, and there's a man behind the counter, and he was asking me questions, and obviously by my responses, he was taking me to be someone who's studied, you know, a bit of Buddhism and so forth. And so he'd asked me who my teacher was, and then I finally like stood up, and I could see it was this little Tibetan man, you know, standing behind the counter, and he told me that he had been a monk and was giving me his history. And then at one point, he said, you know what's so good about all this Buddhism stuff? He's like, it just keeps expanding. You know? And he said that with such this wonderful light in his eyes, you know, after his whole journey. And it's very much, it can be very much the truth. If you're willing to stay in there with these investigations, these explorations, because it can become quite frustrating at times. So one of the other aspects we brought up about the Vipassana were these questions, you know, and we had the 3 marks of existence, you know, which are the questions that will apply to when we're looking at the body, looking at feelings, looking at the mind, looking at phenomena. So the first mark was basically, is it changing? You know, whatever it is you're experiencing, like, you know, with my cousin talking about Edison, it's like, is this changing? Is he going to talk about this for infinity? And right now, you know, and in that moment, that's a saving grace. It's like, no, it is impossible to my mind, you know, it is literally impossible. So that's the first mark. And then the second mark is it genuine happiness or dissatisfaction? Seems to be the more helpful term. Unsatisfactoriness. And the third, the really fun one, is it self or no self? So the thing about this, you know, you look at it and say, okay, well, okay, Buddhism, why those 3 questions? You know, what is it about those 3? And at least what has been tried out by a lot of people over 2,000 years is that if you have a direct realization of impermanence, of dissatisfaction or suffering, and of non-self, that is going to free your mind to a certain degree. And that's why they zero in on basically our fundamental areas of affliction, in the sense of the craving and the ignorance and the aversion. And so each of those, that's its whole scope, is looking at that. Why is it that I want this and I don't want that? And then underneath all of that is, and what is it that I'm misunderstanding about this whole relationship? You know, that would perpetuate this, continue to perpetuate this suffering. So those 3 marks are really, and so when we were looking at the body, which was the first domain, we really focused mostly on that first mark. You know, really looking at physical sensations, tactile sensations that you're feeling and you're in meditation, and just simply applying it is like, okay, you know, is this changing? And doing that again and again and again, and the reason, you know, one of the reasons why we do that so repetitively through a single meditation session, let alone what you might do over weeks and months and years, is because the mind, this level of mind for most of us in this realm is so deeply habituated to just the opposite. Just the opposite is that, no, I actually think this is unchanging. That's the way it feels right now, which is exactly why we go into the domain of feelings next. You know, and that it's not that feelings are not melded with the mind, because you could easily do that. There are certain levels of feelings that are completely a mental, you know, within the mental phenomena aspect. But this is what's so great about when they were putting this approach together and fine-tuning it, is that, you know, it's like, well, we know how we operate. You know, we really know that it has to do a lot with how we feel about this. And so let's stick with that. Let's focus on that domain, because And if you're using the body and you're just being able to be like, yeah, I had that itch and that itch is gone, and you're continually making this impression upon your mind of that, this is how it works, this is how it works, this is how it works. Obviously, eventually, if you have any belief in causality, and we all do on a very basic level, just in terms of, you know, you get up and walk and you think that, yeah, the left, right, that's how I can walk. I mean, it's so instinctual, but being able to acknowledge that level of causality, taking it to a much bigger level, a meta level, as to, okay, yes, this must be the case, that my experience of reality continues to change. And it is only going to be that. And if there's at a certain point that isn't the case, well, then that's very interesting. And you should definitely call us all or email us, get in touch with us immediately. And the last point was about, is that when we're looking at the body, is that the physical sensations that we are experiencing, those tactile sensations that we're experiencing, have one of those four elements, you know, which had earth, which was that sense of solidity and firmness, fire, which is heat or cold, you know, in the sense of cold being the absence of heat, water, which is the fluidity and moisture, and then air, which has that sense of movement, of change. So that when we are looking for those elements in our experience with the physical world, and when, you know, it's important to underscore that again. When we're talking about our physical experience, that it's not only what's happening in relationship to this form, our body, but it's also through our experience of the five senses of the natural world, of the physical world. So that's how that whole external, internal, external exercise can actually work. You know, that moment with my cousin and doing that is because as I'm regarding it, is having that same sense of, you know, I can obviously see him, I can hear him, so these senses are engaged. And so therefore, I'm very mindfully in an interdependent relationship with him right now. I've actually that's my frame of mind, which is far different from when someone pisses you off. You're usually not thinking, you're like, yeah, I'm with this person. In fact, it's so much more of like, I don't want to be with this person, you know. There is such a strong sense of separation that's going on in there. So to literally completely flip the script on your mind and your way of thinking, and to be like, oh, I am completely in an interdependent relationship right now with this person. It probably wouldn't be that helpful to say this in the office during this moment, but in your mindset, as to be able to see like, okay, it's not about, you know, it's really not about me and him right now. We're in this, you know, we're in this right now. And sometimes that can be, obviously in the tough moments, very challenging, because he's the problem. You know, I was fine, you know, I was having a good time until this whole conversation happened, you know, and so we were so deeply habituated to thinking like, oh yeah, as if that was something separate, something individual from me. And it really is, this really also lays a beautiful bedrock of compassion, you know, which we'll get into tonight as well, with the feelings of what cultivates that in a very, very simple way. I mean, that's just one way right there, is immediately when you're in some type of disagreement, whether you've even verbalized it yet or not, is to be like, oh, okay, you know, it definitely takes two for a disagreement. You can be sitting on your own and just thinking about someone. And that appearance in your mind, is giving you that opportunity. This is the whole thing, is that you wouldn't even be able to have the disgruntled feelings or whatever that you're like, man, I cannot believe he said that. And, whatever, he's not even in the building and so forth, and you're already upset. And right there, you are directly in relationship to this being. It doesn't need to mean that their physical form needs to be there, but it's even much more so, this is the thing about it, is that when they are, you actually can be much more engaged in the experience, to the point where you can be consumed by it, right? Where it's like, it'd be another thing if, like, he was not in the building and so forth, but he's right here in front of my face, and I guess I could choose to deal with this or not deal with this. And there are definitely times where, we have this three-step approach in those moments of, okay, yes, I am not well equipped right now to deal with this. I'm going to step away before I do something to create this same situation again, but even worse. So you step away, then there's the times where, well, actually, case in point with my cousin, where you're strong enough to stand there and be with it, be with what's happening. And then, of course, there's the third where you have this beautiful moment of memory. Memory is key. It's completely key to our entire existence as a human being and understanding who we are. Who would you be without your memories? You can think about that for an hour or two. They serve us in countless ways, and one of those ways is in that moment where you're with that person. You're like, oh yeah, I remember this. I remember this feeling, of being so attached to what you think is the right way. I remember that. I would much prefer to be right than happy. And right in that moment, that shift that happens, when you remember how you felt like that and you have behaved like that, and right there, that connects you to that person in a completely different way, as opposed to wanting them to just no longer be on the face of the earth. And so it's something that becomes fundamental, fundamental all through these. So that's enough review. Let's move on to the funness. Yeah. Ooh, so well placed. All right, so we see these colors up here in shapes. So as you look on both sides, there's 4 over here, 4 on this side as well. Just choose a favorite color and walk up to it and position yourself in front of it. All right. So just stand there and observe it. And just observe what happens as you keep looking at this on the wall. And watch how the visual sensation that you're experiencing transforms from information into feeling, or maybe from a feeling into information. So you're going to choose a new color, but before you move, just note, are you reluctant or happy to move away from this particular experience you've been having? And then move on to another color. And once again, just observe what's happening as you focus on this color and shape. How your experience keeps changing. And now move to another color. You're simply just observing, just being a bare witness. Now choose another color. And choose another one. Choose another one. Choose another. And you can return to your seats. So when you were looking at these colors and shapes, did you have any feeling? I mean, was there any feelings at all? So, what were you experiencing?
For some reason, it was more of the colors and shapes. At some point, some shapes reminded me of something.
Mm-hmm.
There's a point that everything was related to memory.
Mm.
It just came. Maybe I was first drawn to red because I really liked it,
Mm-hmm.
and then I was including intellect, thinking like, oh, but red, is really this balancing your tutelage. Fiery anyway, so that's totally fine.
Yeah.
For some reason, you're so attracted to it that it makes you even more. I don't know. It's kind of crazy.
Huh.
But then it started, going through like, oh, the first car my dad bought me was red, and then the first thing that I had was red, and it was kind of all material.
Oh, interesting.
For some reason, and then the next particular one was yellow. Yellow was more calming, and it was more related to the period of my life when I lived in the desert, and it looked like a dune, and that's a super awesome period of my life, and it was calming and peaceful.
Yeah.
And everything else is more or less not that strong, but
Mm-hmm.
it was all first emotion or memory and then emotion.
Mm-hmm.
It was all related to that.
And did it feel as though, was your experience of it as though the feeling was coming from the color?
Or a memory that is related to that color. So I don't know
Okay.
which one is first.
Right.
Which comes first, I don't know.
Right, yeah.
But it was,
Exactly. It's perfectly said. Yeah, anybody else have some experience of feeling in relationship to the colors or shapes? Yeah?
Yeah, well, there's some colors I just really liked, and some I didn't want to leave and felt some aversion for. Like, I don't even know what color this is.
That's great. And that one you had aversion to. Oh, that's interesting. So the one that you didn't know, you felt some aversion to.
I did.
Yeah.
So I couldn't put it so.
Mm-hmm. Couldn't label it. Yeah.
I was getting bored
Yeah.
at certain points, and I was like, why am I so bored with this? And so then okay, let's look at the strokes in the shape. And then I was like, then I started associating a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, now I'm in storyland. Let's go back to the color.
Yeah.
Like, I'm bored.
Yeah. Okay. Excellent. That's great because it really, I mean, all three of those really kind of perfectly exemplify what we go through in terms, especially when your experiences with red and yellow that were positive, pleasurable, where especially the yellow, where there's this sense of calming and that pleasure, or like, I don't know what that color is, the aversion to that which I don't know, to when you have this sense of boredom, neutrality, as to, and you can take, I mean, literally, it's a shape and color, and you can have, from that, which is like total indifference, to like vivid memory association and story, and literally like chapters of your whole life, simply by a signifier such as a color, and then it becomes something where in just that experience, you can understand why it is that when we can have just the most, as they say, it's like, like the little moments, with someone that you like remember so deeply and end up being so profound for you. It wasn't necessarily the time that they threw you that huge party or whatever, but it was the time he or she said that, and it was when you least expected it, and it can have that kind of impact because of what you do with it, and it can also be taken to, of course, in the place of aversion. For instance, like when there's something you don't understand, and that lack of being able to identify and label something, can go all the way to like, the deepest forms of prejudice and racism, as to, I don't understand this color and shape, and so forth, and therefore, you know, you'll take it to the extreme to kill over that. You know, this is the potential of what we can do with our appearances. You know, we could go to killing someone or loving them for a lifetime. You know, literally going off of what can literally be a color and shape, let alone getting into how's this really working in my mind, you know. Exactly that. It's like, do I really think that, oh, that the feeling like red does mean passion? You know, does it mean that? You know, and so forth. Whereas someone could walk around and be like, oh, you know, red to me represents pure boredom. You know, it's just like the most boring color ever. You know, and that's something where, you know, thankfully, what's underneath it is how are we working with these appearances, you know, all the time. And this is the thing about feeling, is that, I mean, when we're really honest about it, for most of us, I think that we might agree that we pretty much model our whole world based on how we feel about something. Be it a person, a situation, politically, a place, or whatever. It ends up being like that really constitutes our world, you know. And then it becomes like, okay, well, if that's the case, why are feelings so important to us? I mean, that pretty much most of the choices that we will make are based on how we feel, you know. And it goes all the way to your very literal survival as a human being. I mean, from the moment that we really stood upright, you know, that the whole understanding of sex was really about procreation. You know, that's really the way someone might feel towards another, that base level of physical attraction, was to continue me. You know, there's some level of understanding that got associated with, oh, so with this person, then I can create more of me's, and me will continue in some way. To, I'm hungry, you know. What if you didn't feel hungry? You know, what if someone did not have that sense of and they just didn't eat? You know, more than likely in most cases that person will die. You know, so even so, on the most base levels of, you know, our livelihood, we're working with feeling, you know, from that gut level all the way to the meta level. So, and this is a question definitely, you know, one us all to consider, is that why do you think it is then that we don't scrutinize our feelings? In other words, like, you know, there's times we do that. I'm sure there are times, why did I get so pissed at him, you know, or whatever. But oftentimes that won't be the case. You won't sit around thinking about why is it that, you know, that I'm doing that, I had all the feelings about this or that. So why do you think it is that we don't take that time to really look into our feelings? You know, I'm not talking about the situation, I mean literally the feeling. So what do people think? You know, why do you think we don't want to look inside that?
I think it might be painful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
If you're angry, you got angry over something, you don't want to keep living that anger.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I mean, there's no doubt. I mean, if I'm feeling some level of anger about something, the last thing in the world in that moment I want to do is examine it. You know, I want to be rid of that. I don't want to be feeling that. So that's absolutely true.
There's also permission, at least what they call in psychology, which is exactly that.
Mm-hmm.
So if you've done that for so many times,
Mm-hmm.
and you're afraid of change,
Yep.
it's kind of insanity. You do the same things over and over again, expect different results. Which
Right.
is like definition of insanity, but like, doesn't matter, keep that.
Yeah.
Hoping that something might change
Mm-hmm.
somewhere. But I just had a talk before this with my therapist, and I'm Skyping with him, and because he's not in LA, and we're talking. He says, and he's also Buddhist. He's like, isn't that a beauty of this thing that we have, to actually be able to not change the world or a situation, but how you feel about it. Because you can't really do that with a lot of stuff around you. You can't, change that like you can't change anybody, nor situation, nor circumstances. You can't.
Right.
But if you just change how you feel, that's your ultimate reality. That's your world. So it's no longer what it is for you or for somebody else. It's for me. It might be illusional, but like it's awesome. I call it reality. It's like,
Hey, well, that's just it, right?
it works for me. It works for me.
Yeah, exactly.
And I want everybody happy. What's wrong with that?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's just, you're right too, especially when you use that word of delusion or illusion. Because this is the whole thing, is that much of the illusion is working. That's the thing about it. Yeah. And I mean, what you then to say, for you to say, well, if it works, it works. That's exactly what we've been talking about, this whole thing with the truth of your experience. If it works for you, then great. But then there's the level of when, of course, when you start to identify with a feeling, then it gets dangerous. It can get extremely dangerous. But, in a day-to-day situation, and this is what this whole approach is about, actually, is that with shamatha and vipassana, using the combination of this method, is that it really is about eliminating really primarily two delusions. One would be that my identity it is my feeling, or that my feelings are my identity, or what I feel is who I am. That, because of course, I mean, if this was to be fully the case, and this is why people are hospitalized, because I do think, in terms of from the clinical side, they're able to see someone who has completely surrendered, whether it's into schizophrenia and so forth, into the shifts of identity, and those are based so much in feeling, what a person is feeling for this. And if you've ever, hung out with someone who's bipolar or schizophrenic and so forth, and he's saying, I mean, it's a freaking nightmare. I mean, it's a nightmare, and that's this, but this is like, I think they've kind of said this in some ways, about kind of, it's either like the fine line between someone who is certifiable or a genius, is that, you actually, in an asylum, are seeing people that are actually more in touch with reality more closely, but this is the thing, is that if you don't have like the understanding and the wisdom about how to deal with these shifting feelings and who I am, because we all have that in that moment of, literally, it's so deeply embedded that our language is happening at such a tremendous rate of speed that it syncopates, it seems like, in perfect alignment with the feeling. And that's why it comes out, that first word is, I am. I am pissed. Right there. That is something that's so deep within the core of our experience of a feeling, that it just, the language supports it. The language, versus being able to have that experience arise, have that feeling arise, and literally being able to see it. I mean, that alone is huge, is where you can just see it. You see, and I'm using the word see in that sense of really sensing it, like, okay. I mean, and it doesn't have to always, of course, be in the afflicted sense, because of course it can be something that is joyful, where there's this like, ooh, wonderful sense of anticipation, that's kind of building up, and you're feeling that, you're seeing this feeling rising and growing, and then it's always interesting, of course, where like when you were looking at the colors and you were feeling, boredom with it, You know, so you see that, and then it's like to notice when the boredom dissipates, you know, which is a really intriguing transition. Because from a shamatha, you know, from a meditative perspective, one would say the reason why you become bored is because of a lack of attention, a lack of focus. That the experience of boredom is lack of focus. And then what's interesting is that if you're like looking at this orange triangle and you're like, yeah, I don't really anything, and then you stick with it, and then something shifts. And undoubtedly, when that acknowledgement of being interested, or at least even engaged, you know, might not be as positive as interested, but you're engaged now, is because now that the attention has started to sharpen, you know, as opposed to being diffused, that's what's so, you know, debilitating about boredom, you know, is that dullness, and why, you know, clinical depression, you know, and so forth. It's like when it can shift so easily into that, where that's like, the orange has no meaning for me, you know, to that it can go to that place where like, yeah, you know, life has no meaning to me, and not being able to once again be able to watch it moving, you know, to watch it, okay, it's this now, and then it's kind of faded away, and now this has come up. So that really, that delusion about that I am my feelings, that's a huge one. I mean, that alone right there can be, you know, what could, you know, keep you interested in trying these practices out. Because it's certainly something that will probably continue to come up day in, day out. And the other aspect, the second delusion really, is that is our experience of liking this, disliking that, feeling indifferent about this, that experience is inherent in the appearance. So our experience of liking, disliking, or indifference is somehow baked in to that person. It's not, you know, maybe not going to really take hold with the color and the shape on the wall, but with people it usually does. People, you can usually be like, yeah, the disliking or the liking, you know, I'm really attracted to this person. There is something about that person, you know, there's a chemistry there. I mean, we've got wonderful language to support this, you know, way of thinking. That it's somehow inherent in them. Now, as to not fall off into, you know, complete nihilism with this, is that of course the reality of the situation that works is that you could not be having those experiences if it wasn't in relation to that person. You know, so there is the interdependence of that. That's functional. Is that whatever it is, whether they're in the room with you or you're thinking about them, there's someone you've met, and you're attracted to them, and so you're like, wow, you know, and just, well, of course, you know, you wouldn't even be able to have that experience with once again, not without that appearance. So this is kind of the core of interdependence in that sense, is that you're working with it. That's what constitutes your whole experience is, you know, whether you're looking at the shape or you're looking at a person and seeing how as to, oh, I couldn't even be having this experience if it wasn't in relation to the appearance, be it the paper on the wall or the person in the room. The important aspect of that, though, is thinking that whatever the qualitative experience is, that it's baked in, that it's inherent, that it is of the nature of that person. You know, that, you know, Brad Pitt is inherently handsome. You know, I mean, that's just it. Like you see there, we're wonderful. Someone to prove that just is not self-existently the case. But there is, you know, we do this with so many things. We do this with food, all of our wonderful senses. I mean, you know, at one point I was thinking about tonight, I was like, yeah, maybe I'll play a whole series of songs at a very loud level and see what our experience, but we all know that, you know, we all know what that's like when, I always love this, and I remember this more happening with, you know, being a teenager and so forth, that, you know, whatever, you're just jamming to something and your friend like jumps in the car and then they like change it. They just change it, they don't even matter, it just changes something and something, you're like, what the hell? You know, you're like loving this and they just changed it to something that you're like, you think is horrendous and they love, you know, and then the other friend's gonna be like, hey man, turn that off, turn it to the, you know, this. And right there is like a whole microcosm of how things are always working, you know. Was this good for you? Or is this, you know, or is this terrible for you? Or this, you know, I don't really care, play whatever you want to play, you know, and so forth. So it's, we're experiencing that through all of our levels of senses, you know, all the time.
What about the other side of the feelings when it goes to the whole matrix of feelings, attachments, and suffering?
Yes, attachment. Well, we're going to get into that actually. We're going to get into that actually after the meditation, because that, of course, is that really is, you know, there are the kind of two pinpoints on this experience of liking, disliking, and neutrality or indifference is how we're misunderstanding it, you know, and then there's the attachment, you know, that the whole experience of grasping or aversion, the other side of that coin. So yeah, we will get to that. Let's see here. Actually, you know what we'll do? Let's take a break now, because we'll be doing a meditation, and that's perfect timing.